Buenos tardes. Unfortunately, that's about the extent of my Spanish, so I apologize for that. But I do thank you for the opportunity to come speak today. I want to personally thank Carlos Pinero for inviting me to come speak here. I also have to thank Jose, right there. Yesterday I missed my connecting flight in Lisbon, and he was generous enough to give me a ride here yesterday, so thank you. I appreciate that. With that, I'll go ahead and get started here. So I've titled my presentation, The Production and Trade Forecast in the Global Swine Pork Industry. And I'll just say that I work for the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Specifically, I work in the branch of the Foreign Agricultural Service, and the division I work in is the Office of Global Analysis. Okay, so outline of my presentation. 4 points that I'll be covering today. First off, we'll talk about the Foreign Agricultural Service, specifically the part that I work in the U.S. Department of Agriculture. Another thing I'll talk about is our data collection process, how we disseminate that data, and then I'm going to actually talk about our global pork production and trade forecasts that we publish every 6 months. Okay, so getting into things. So looking specifically at the U.S. Department of Agriculture, the Foreign Agricultural Service. Okay, so the Foreign Agricultural Service, in general, it's about promoting U.S. products abroad, globally, right? So we're all about exports, right? And a lot of what we do is looking at the global market and trade, right? So there's 3 parts to the division that I work in. The first part is the International Production Assessment. Specifically what they're looking at is they're providing an analytical analysis for crop production, specifically looking at weather and things of that nature and how that will impact potential yields globally. And then we also have the Global Policy Analysis Division. They're looking more at policy issues and they are looking at biofuels and things of that nature. And then you have the group that I'm in, the Global Commodity Analysis Division, and that's what I'll talk a little bit more now. And as I go on here, I'll kind of refer to a thing called lockup. Just keep in mind in general, that's a process that we use to actually come to our forecasts and our numbers and data, and I'll explain that process a little bit farther down in my presentation here. Okay, so looking specifically at the Global Commodity Analysis Division, the division that I work in. Okay, we cover various commodities that we're looking at here, and all of these commodities are part of what we call the lockup process. But if you look here at the top, you can see that we have the grains, cotton, oilseeds. These are what we consider lockup commodities. So every month, these analysts, they're going into this process, they're looking at what has happened over the last month as far as production. Have there been any yield impacts, weather impacts? You know, we've recently in the U.S. had 2 hurricanes that you might be aware of, Harvey and Irma. How is that impacting grain production? Is that impacting any trade, exports, right? The Port of Houston, there's a fair amount of grain that comes out of there. So has that impacted anything? So when they come out with their reports, they'll address any of those issues. But then you have on the bottom there, you have 5 other commodities. Right? So you have livestock and pork, you have dairy, horticulture, like apples, pears, things of that nature, sugar, and you also have coffee. So looking at the green square, livestock and poultry, the group that I'm in, okay, we're considered a lockup group, but we only publish our production and trade forecasts every 6 months. So April and October, we come out with our updated production and trade forecasts. Okay, so that's kind of there's the division that I work in, that's the little bit of the process of what goes on there. So let's look a little bit deeper, specifically what do we do? I've alluded at some of those things already, but specifically what do? We analyze and evaluate market intelligence, right? So we're getting information from, I believe we have about 150 posts throughout the world at various countries. We actually have a post in Madrid, Spain. We have them in other countries, China, Africa, various countries in Africa, Mexico, Argentina, countries like that. So we're getting information from them. We're collecting that, we're analyzing it, okay? Then we take that information and we make official USDA estimates, right? So later on when I talk in my presentation, I'll talk about those official estimates that we have, that we publish, and are publicly available. Another thing that we do, I kind of talked about the lockup process. So we're monthly updating this information as far as production and trade. And then we actually have that in a database, which we refer to as our PS&D, or Production, Supply, and Distribution database. And this PS&D is online. You can go get this information and download it into an Excel format if you really want to. And as I discussed earlier, we have published monthly commodity reports. And so like for the livestock group, we will be publishing a report actually October 12th. So that's when we published our report. We also, within those reports, will also do market reports, kind of an analysis that we're seeing going on in specific countries, just kind of information that we see that might be pertinent to the specific commodity. Now, I talked about this production, supply, and distribution system, or this database that we have. This is a screenshot of the database. So if you go to our website, usda.fas.gov, that is our website. And if you would go to our PS&D system, you can actually grab this information. So, for example, you have 4 columns here. You have commodities, attributes, countries, and then market years. So if you wanted to, say, you wanted to grab pork, right? So you could get the meat swine. That's the commodity that you want, the attributes that you want. So basically you're going to get supply and demand, right? So you're going to get production, you're going to get imports, exports, and consumption. So those are the 4 main things that you're going to get, which basically cover supply and demand. Then you can grab the specific countries if you want to. You could grab it globally, you could grab it for just maybe China or Mexico, and then you can grab it for the various years that you're looking for. So if you want to grab the most recent, you can grab 2017, run the query, and you can get the Excel data. So this is all publicly available. Now, that's a little bit more broad overview of what we do. Let's look a little bit more about specifically this lockup process that I've been discussing here. So there's 3 things I'm going to cover here. I'm going to specifically look at our WSDA report, which is the World Agricultural Supply and Demand Estimates. Okay. Next thing I'll look at is the FAS commodity reports, then also discuss the USDA commodity databases. So this WSDA report, what is this thing, right? It's the World Agricultural Supply and Demand Estimates. So really what this is when we talk about the lockup process, this is the deliverable. This is what comes out every month. It's about a 40 to 50 page document. You can go download this off of the USDA website right now if you really wanted to. But you can see here, this was the screenshot of the most recent one, and I grabbed this from August 10th. We actually had one published last week, and we'll have another one published in about 3 weeks from now. But you can see right off the top there, it covers every commodity that the USDA looks at. So the first commodity it looks at is wheat, right? So it gives you a little synopsis of what's going on for wheat, not only in the US, but globally. And it also gives some discussion on prices as well. So this is just a screenshot of the front page, but if you dig further in there is information not only on the grains, but there's information on meat as well. So you have beef, cattle, pork, poultry in there as well, dairy, things of that nature. So it's a very comprehensive document with a lot of information, a lot of data. Now, the FAS commodity reports, what are those things? So specifically, the ones that I contribute to are obviously livestock and poultry, which is the screenshot on the left, to your left there. So what we're looking at here is this is our report that we publish every 6 months. So this contains information as far as what we see globally for production and trade. So the first page here, the report that we developed here looks at specifically an issue that was going on, which was highly pathogenic avian influenza. If you might recall, there's a lot of that going on, spreading not only in the US, but also in Europe and China, also spread to parts of Africa. So we felt that was a pertinent topic that needed to be addressed. So we discussed that on the first page here to give just some general information that we see is going on. And also just note there are other reports that you can grab from the FAS website as well. On your right here, you can see I've given an example of a report for the grains. So there's information as far as what's going on with corn production and wheat production. So you have that information that you can grab as well. Now, let's talk a little bit about how we get this information, right? So much like you guys may do, you have your general media outlets that you can get information from. But the specific thing and the value added that FAS does and contributes to these reports and kind of the information is what we refer to as our attaché reports, right? And I've highlighted that in red because that's kind of the value added piece that we have, right? We have 150 posts globally. So what we're looking at is we are getting all this information from these posts, and as I discussed, we're analyzing it, we're evaluating this information, and that's the information that we're taking and disseminating. So that's kind of our value added piece that we provide. Now, FAS, we grab all that information, and how we use that is then in the lockup process. That's the piece that we bring to the lockup process as well, right? So this lockup process brings in various USDA agencies. So FAS is just one piece of that lockup process. As you can see in this graphic here, there's 5 different agencies in USDA that contribute to this lockup process, right? So you have NASS, the National Agricultural Statistics Service. You have the Joint Agricultural Weather Facility, so they're the ones looking at weather patterns. They're basically meteorologists. Then you have the Foreign Agricultural Service, which I'm a part of. You have the Economic Research Service. They're more US focused. And then you have Farm Service Agency, which they're more in contact with the actual producers themselves. So you have this broad breadth of knowledge that comes together a week before this WASDE report is published. We sit down, literally sit down in a roundtable meeting for about 3 hours, and we basically hash out what we think is going to happen for production and trade for the next month. Okay, so that's kind of that process. And then the World Agricultural Outlook Board, they're kind of the governing body, if you will. They're the ones that control the meeting. They're the ones that finally publish a lot of these numbers as well. So let's talk about this lockup process. What actually happens, right? So the week before this WASDE report is published, we start having our meetings, and we refer to those as interagency meetings, right? Because we have those 5 different groups of USDA coming together talking about what's going on. Specific things that we're talking about: foreign production, foreign supply and demand, what's going on in the US market, not only for production but also for prices, right? And then not as much for the livestock side, but there is some discussion on weather, but we do look at what's going on in crops, right? Because you have those inputs from corn and soybeans going into the livestock for feed, right? So you have inputs that you need to look at because those can impact what happens for production, right? High prices mean there's probably going to be some sort of a change in supply. Producers are going to change their production habits, right? So then we actually have the lockup process. So what happens the day of lockup? So lockup is kind of, it's a big deal. A lot of things kind of shut down when that happens, literally. Like there's certain websites that I can't get onto. So it's a pretty unique process for USDA, but specifically there's a complete secrecy, kind of this idea that we're not going to let any of this information out. I actually signed a non-disclosure form when I took my job because I basically have information prior to this report, so I can't trade on the futures market, anything like that, because I have knowledge. Right, so there's very much this integrity of the numbers we're trying to provide. Right, so there's specific things that happen when we go into lockup. There's no cell phones that you can bring in, so we're completely cut off from the outside world, more or less, for about 6 hours, honestly. And as you go in, if you have a cell phone, you have to surrender it. If you have a computer, you have to surrender it. You cannot bring any of that in because there's literally armed guards at the doors, and then there literally is steel doors that they shut behind you. There's actually steel shutters on the windows, right? So you can't even look out the windows, anything like that. This is very much secrecy, trying to keep the integrity of the numbers here. And so more or less no outside contact, right? So we go through this lockup process, and what happens once they get into the lockup is all the numbers are brought in there that we've discussed in our pre-meetings. They give the numbers to the Secretary of Agriculture. He signs off on the document, and then they tell him what's in the document, right? So the idea is even the Secretary of Agriculture, Sonny Perdue, he can't even influence the numbers, right? So really it's supposed to come from the analysts coming up, and then he literally just says, okay, I take what you guys have told me as far as these numbers, now tell me what's in it, then they publish it, right? So we're trying to, as much as possible, keep the integrity of the numbers and keep them as unbiased as possible. So we have this document now, what happens with it, right? So we release this report, and it's a timely report, right? So the day that it's going to be published, it's always going to be published at 12 p.m. It's always going to go out at the same time, irregardless. So that is a hard, fast deadline that we have to abide by. The report goes out, and now it starts to get caught by the media and so forth and distributed. That way, you know, we get the report, we'll send it out to our posts, or they'll send it out to their contacts that they have. So very much it's a report that we try to distribute as broadly as possible. Now, as I had mentioned with a lot of these reports, our objective is we want to keep them unbiased, we want to keep them as objective as possible, apolitical as possible, they're official, they're timely, and they're also publicly available. So you can go grab this information. Now, just a little bit about these numbers. They are official U.S. numbers, so it's not just another FAS report. We do spend a lot of time on these numbers because they're official numbers. We actually start looking at these numbers weeks in advance to having these meetings, just because we know the integrity of the numbers that we're distributing here and just how they're going to be used, because they are used for policy analysis in the U.S. and so forth, and globally they're accessible to anyone. So let's talk a little bit about these numbers, right? So I've alluded to this PS&D piece. When we distribute these numbers, there are specific pieces that we distribute, okay? So if you think about from an economics terms, right? I'm an economist, so I think about things in supply and demand, right? And the equilibrium of economics is supply equals demand, right? That's the place you want to be. Not always the case, but that's where we try to be. We kind of make this delusion in our mind that that supply always equals demand. Right, so what are the pieces? So let's kind of parse out that equation of supply equals demand. So what's kind of on that supply side of things, right? So we have what we call beginning stocks. You could think of this as maybe pork that's in cold storage, right? That's your beginning stocks. You have the pork there. It can be released on the market if need be, right? But you also have currently going on production, right? So that's the production of the pork that is going on. But you also have imports that are being received from other countries, right? So that's kind of that supply piece. You have basically three components: beginning stocks, production, and imports. Okay, so that's our supply side. Now let's look at demand, right? So demand, we're looking at, okay, what are you exporting? How much pork are you exporting? Also, how much are you consuming, domestic consumption? But then what's left over at the end, ending stocks, right? That would be at the end of the year, how much pork is maybe in cold storage, right? So now you have these two supply and demand pieces. When we distribute this production, supply, and distribution table, those are the key components that we have in that table. And why this is important, it's an organized way of showing what's actually going on for production, supply, and distribution over time. So we can kind of get a time series of data to see what's actually happening over time for production and trade. Now, so that kind of gives you a snapshot of what kind of goes on the USDA side of things, and specifically my job, what I do on a day-to-day basis. Now, let's start looking at the forecast. What are we saying is going to go on? So specifically, I'm going to look at global meat production and trade. Then I'll start looking at what's going on for US pork production and trade. And then I'll dig a little bit deeper and look into EU pork production and trade. Okay, so those are the three things I'll talk about here. So globally, what's going on? So this is kind of just a table to give you a snapshot of what's going on. By and large, you can see on the top table here, there's a lot of green arrows, right? So what are we looking at here? Beef, pork, and broiler meat. By and large, globally, production is going up, right? Same thing for the US and EU. Production is going up for all three meat protein sources. But if we look at China, we can see that production is down, is forecast down for pork and broiler meat. Right? China's going through some industry consolidation, and I'll talk about that a little bit later on, what's kind of going on there. Now, if we look at the bottom here as far as exports of all the meat proteins, you can see globally, they're all forecast up. Same for the US. Right? Our exports for all three meats are forecast to increase for 2017. Now looking at EU, beef and pork exports are forecast to increase as well. The broiler meats are forecast to decrease, and some of the things that we've seen is the highly pathogenic avian influenza. There's been some culling and depopulation going on as a result of that, and they've lost some export markets because of that, and so has the US. We've been able to regain some of those, fortunately. So it's kind of a dynamic markets that are going on for not only for pork, but also for broiler meat. Now looking at China, you can see their exports are down for all. As I alluded to before, they're going through some industry consolidation, so there's demand is still very strong in China, so they're not really looking to export a lot of their product. Now let's look a little bit more at what's going on for global pork production and trade. So you can see in the blue bars here we have production. Production is forecast to increase slightly for 2017. China's been going through its consolidation, so there's been some production decline there, but there's also been some significant gains in the EU and the US, which are kind of outweighing those production losses in China. But more importantly, looking at the red line, we can see that exports are forecast to continue to grow for 2017. There are significant gains in 2016, primarily from China importing more as China emerged as the leading global importer of pork in 2016. We're going to see that kind of start to continue in 2017 as well. Now, looking specifically at the EU and US, right? The EU and US are the two main exporters of pork globally. So there's competition going between those two countries to see who can export the most, right? So you can see in 2015 that the US and EU were pretty close, but 2016 comes around, China gets on the market, starts buying significantly from EU, and the EU strengthened their position globally as an exporter quite a bit in 2016, and we're going to see that continue in 2017, despite the US still having increased exports for 2017. Now, US production and trade. So the blue bars, we can see that production is up for 2017. That's what we're forecasting. And I think that's still going to be the case. These last few months, we've seen some significant weekly slaughter amounts for pork production. We're actually starting to get to the point where we may not have enough slaughter capacity for all the hogs that we're raising in the US. There are more slaughter facilities coming online, but it's taking them a while to get ramped up. So it'll be interesting to see what happens over the next month or two with that. But also you can see the red line, our exports are growing for 2017. A lot of that is demand from Mexico. We are seeing some growth in Asia, but we have pretty stiff competition in Asia coming from EU product. So now looking at the EU, we can see production is up marginally to almost flat, right? But the significant thing is the exports. As I alluded to in 2016, the EU exported a lot of pork to China. We're expecting that to still continue in 2017. So we'll see what happens as far as 2017 goes for exports here, but I think they're going to be very strong. So looking a little bit deeper into EU exports, where are they sending the pork, right? And so we can see here that a lot of the exports have been going to China. So if you look at 2015 and 16, let's see if this works. I don't know if you can see that, but in 2015, China was a pretty big market, but then it jumps up in 2016. A lot of exports in 2016 from the EU went to China, right? And so we're forecasting that to continue to grow for 2017. Now let's look a little bit differently. So I discussed how the EU sent a lot to China. Now let's look at China's imports. What's China reporting as far as pork imports, and where's it coming from? Now, in general, we can see here from 2015 to 2016, China's imports more than doubled in a year. That's a significant jump in imports. For a country that is the leading producer of pork, for them to increase imports that significantly in 1 year. That's it's almost unheard of. So very interesting time to be seeing this occur and go on, because they're a large consumer of pork as well. So their demand it catches a lot of attention, especially from the U.S. and the EU. Now we're forecast to see that grow or continue to be about as strong in 2017. Now, one of the things I want to point out is I've parsed out the data specifically to look at China's imports from Germany, Spain, and the U.S. So if we look at just Germany and Spain, nearly 37% of China's imports came from just those two countries, right? Just two countries in the EU supplied over 37% of China's imports. Now, if we take that one step further, we include the U.S. in that, China's getting over 50% of their imports from three countries, right? Now, when you think about that, China is also the largest producer, but they're also importing pork from the two largest producers globally, the U.S. and the EU, right? So that's a lot of pork, and you can see here I would say probably Germany and Spain were the largest gainers out of that. The U.S. gained as well, but Germany and Spain were the largest gainers in China's imports in 2016. And I think we'll see that continue for 2017 as well. Now, as I bring my discussion to a close here, a few things I want to bring to your attention. Giving some discussion on the forecast here, I just want to note that on October 12th, there will be two reports that will be coming out that will be useful for you. Specifically, we'll be releasing our updated production and trade forecast. So this whole process I discussed, literally we're in that process right now. We're going through that whole process of the numbers and developing these numbers, and they're going to be released on October 12th. So our WASDE report will be coming out on the 12th, and also our updated production and supply and distribution tables will be released on the 12th. You can get that information from our FAS website, which is www.fas.usda.gov. Okay. So with that, thank you for the opportunity to come speak here and to visit beautiful Sevilla. I appreciate it.